Well, I hope everyone's having a good day. I know I am, and anxious to have another Bible study together. This time we're going to look at John chapter 21, and we're going to come to the end of our study of the Gospel of John. We've seen already in the Gospel of John, most recently, the crucifixion and the resurrection of Jesus in chapters 19 and 20. We saw how Jesus appeared to Mary and then to other disciples, and then with Thomas gathered with them finally at the end. And John told us at the end of that chapter that there were many other signs that could have been recorded, but these were recorded or presented that you might believe. There is one more or a couple more things, however, that we would need to know about the story of Jesus before the story can end. Although that statement, that famous statement in John chapter 20, sounds like it could be the end of the gospel, it's really probably not meant to be the signal of the end of the story, because there are some questions that kind of remain in the narrative, or what we might call some unfinished business of the story. And John chapter 21 is going to explore these and kind of tie up those loose ends. There are at least three things that might be on our mind as we come to this chapter in the Gospel of John. The first one would be about the status of Peter. Remember, it was Peter and the other disciple who ran to the tomb. Peter and the other disciple have seen Jesus twice now in John chapter 20, but we've not been told about the relationship between Peter and Jesus. Does that get fixed? Does Jesus and Peter, do they reconcile with each other? Is that relationship fixed? So that's one thing that John has not told us about. Then we would like to know what's next for the disciples. Now, of course, we've heard some hints about this in chapters 13 through 17, the farewell discourse of Jesus on the night that he had his Last Supper with the disciples. Remember, he talked about going away, how they would not see him anymore, and then they would see him, how he was going to send the Spirit. But exactly what are the disciples supposed to be doing? What is their job now? Well, chapter 21, I think, will address that as well. And then perhaps as a more minor type of a question, we might ask, who's going to be in charge here? What is the relationship among the disciples going to look like? Is one of them going to be the leader? Is one of them going to slip into the place of Jesus? Or exactly how are they going to work? And I believe chapter 21 addresses that question as well. There is a well-known story in the Gospel of Luke that is strongly, very strongly reflected here in John chapter 21. And that's not to say that those are the same miracles, but that Jesus performs the same miracle here in John chapter 21 that he did earlier in Luke chapter 5. We've said throughout our study of the Gospel of John that there seems to be this understanding on John's part that his readers already know the basic story about Jesus, that they know the kind of things that would be available in Matthew, Mark, or Luke. And this, I think, is a good illustration of that, where we have a miracle of catching fish that is remarkably similar to one that Jesus performed at the beginning of his ministry in Luke 5. And so, as people who were reading or hearing the Gospel of John for the first time came to this, I do believe they would have remembered that story that they had been told and would have said, I see what's going on here. So we have that kind of connection going on here in this story. That's a little bit unique in this gospel. But also, this chapter is mostly about this first question on the screen there. It is mostly about the restoration of Peter. He is kind of the main character in both of the scenes of this chapter. And so the questions that we have about Peter's relationship with Jesus do get answered here. So With that in mind, let's go to chapter 21 here. It says that after these things, Jesus manifested or revealed himself again to the disciples at the Sea of Tiberias this time, or as we would call the Sea of Galilee. It's called the Sea of Tiberias because the city of Tiberias sits right on the western shore of the Sea of Galilee. It says he manifested himself in this way, that Simon Peter and Thomas called Didymus, and Nathanael of Cana in Galilee, and the sons of Zebedee, that would be James and John, and two others of his disciples were together. So we have seven disciples listed here: Peter, Thomas, Nathanael, that's three, the two sons of Zebedee, and then two others, four more, seven disciples altogether. And Simon says, I'm going fishing. And they said to him, we're coming with you. And so they went out and they got into the boat, and that night they caught nothing. John takes a lot of time here to set up this scene. And whenever a gospel author or any biblical author does that, for a matter of fact, when there's a lot of preparatory work going into the background, it's the author's way of telling us that this is going to be something important. You need to know what was going on here in order to make sense out of what happens next or of the words that are going to be spoken. And so this fishing story is the context for understanding the revelation. It says that Jesus manifested himself or revealed himself to his disciples here. And this fishing setting is important to that. Of the seven disciples that are mentioned here, there's really nothing extremely noteworthy about the list here, except Nathanael, because we haven't heard about Nathanael since chapter 1. In chapter 1, you remember that he is the one who said, can any good thing come out of Nazareth? And so again, as we come to the end of the story, as we've seen before, there's kind of a coming of full circle of some things that we saw at the beginning now showing up at the end. So Peter says, I'm going fishing. And it's kind of interesting if you were to do some research and some study among the things that have been said and written about this gospel, how much time and effort has been put into the question of why Peter goes fishing. And of course, John doesn't say why. That's kind of John's little clue to us that it's really not important why he did this. We've seen this before. Why did Pilate act like he did? Well, John's answer seems to be it doesn't matter why he did it. What he did is important. Some people have suggested that maybe Peter has given up, that he doesn't know what to think next. Well, I'm just going to go back to my former life, that he has lost his faith or something like that. But the text doesn't say anything like that. It could be just as well that the disciples really didn't know if they were ever going to see Jesus again, that they didn't know really what to expect next, and that Peter says, well, I need maybe something to occupy myself, or there are bills that need to be paid. We need to go catch some fish and pay some bills. There's really no reason to suggest that Peter's attitude here is negative, that he has somehow given up on Jesus or what he knows. We're told, most importantly in verse 3, that they fished at night and they caught nothing. That is very similar to what we are told in Luke chapter 5 and verse 5. You remember the story there that Jesus had been teaching. The fishermen were out washing their nets, and after Jesus was done, he said, put out into the deep and let down your nets for a catch. And Peter said, Master, we worked hard all night and caught nothing. So the situation here is similar, exactly similar to that in Luke chapter 5. And so, lo and behold, as we come back here to the text in John, that it says in verse 4 that the day is now breaking. We heard this mentioned in chapter 20, that when it was just starting to dawn, Mary Magdalene came to the tomb. And we noted that especially in this gospel, whenever we are told about what time of day it is, especially if it is dark, that is significant because it has a symbolic quality to it. That people who operate in the nighttime are in the dark. They don't understand, or they lack insight into things. And so the light comes, as it did in chapter 20, the dawning of the day, and then there is clarity. And there is also newness. Dawn suggests the newness of day as well. And so we've kind of got that going on in the background here, that this situation is about to change, that the light is about to come on, as it were, that somebody's going to get an understanding of something that they perhaps did not have before. And there are all kinds of little echoes perhaps going on in the text here as well. When Peter or when John tells us here that they caught nothing, we might remember what Jesus said in John 15 and verse 5, that apart from me, you can do nothing. So all of that is kind of in the mix. It's kind of in the air, as it were, as we come to this story. So in verse 4, the day is breaking. And Jesus stood on the beach, and the disciples did not know that it was Jesus. We've talked about this before. There may have been something that was a little different about the physical appearance of Jesus. But in this case, I get the impression that it's maybe the darkness that causes them not to recognize him. They've seen him twice already now after his resurrection. So the difference of his appearance shouldn't be that much of an obstacle to them by now. No, I think the better reading is that it's still dark outside. They can't see who it is standing on the shore over there, and they can't make him out. But there are again echoes here of what we saw back in chapter 20. Remember that Mary Magdalene came to the tomb early at dawn, and that there was a recorded there in verse 19 and again in 26 of Jesus standing and Mary not recognizing. So we have those same elements here. Dawn, Jesus standing, and the people do not understand or know who he is. And so Jesus says, children, you do not have any fish, do you? And the word children is not perhaps meant to be anything significant. I saw one translation where the author used the word lads. Hey guys, that kind of thing. It's not anything special here, I don't think. But he says, do you not have any fish? Did you not catch anything? And they said, no. And so Jesus says, well, put the net down on the right-hand side of the boat and you will find a catch. Now, this is interesting because they're bringing the boats into the shallow water, and this is not normally where you would find a great catch of fish. And so Jesus says to them, throw the net over on the right side of the boat and you will find a catch. Why they decided to cooperate, I don't know, but it says they followed Jesus' orders. And lo and behold, they enclosed so many and so large a fish in the net that they were not able to haul it in because of the great number of fish. I mean, the net is so full of fish that they cannot bring it up into the boat. It's too heavy for them to handle. Well, of course, as we said, this is the same miracle that happened in Luke chapter 5, where the disciples had fished all night and caught nothing, and then Jesus tells them to go out and put the net down, and they caught so many fish, remember, that the boats began to sink at that time. And so, verse 7, the disciple whom Jesus loved, who may very well be the Apostle John, said to Peter, "It is the Lord." And so John puts it together. He remembers this has happened before. And so we have Peter and John. Kind of interesting, these two guys, because remember, they were the ones that ran to the tomb in John chapter 20 when Mary Magdalene told them that it was empty. So here, John puts this together, makes this observation, and just like we had in chapter 20, that Peter gets excited about this and he goes ahead. And so in verse 7, when Simon Peter heard that it was the Lord, he put on his outer garment, for he was stripped for work, and threw himself into the sea. Some of the older versions here say something like he was naked, but Peter would not have been stark naked out there working. And he certainly wouldn't have put on his garment to jump into the water. It simply means that he tightened up the garment that he was wearing because he's going to jump into the water and make his way to the shore. And so it's just a detail that as soon as Peter recognizes what's going on, he grabs his garment, ties it up, and makes it so it won't flop around and get in the way in the water, and jumps into the water. He threw himself into the sea to make it to the land, just like he had outrun John going to the tomb. And so they get there. And of course, it is indeed Jesus. I'm getting behind on my PowerPoint slides here. So we've talked about why Peter went fishing, not the point here, and the miracle in John 21. And so in verse 10, Jesus said, "Bring some of the fish which you have now caught." The answer is why? Because we're told there in verse 9, Jesus has already made a fire. There's already some fish on the fire. So why does Jesus want them to bring more fish? Well, you might say, well, because the fish that Jesus had on the fire would not have been enough. That's possible. But knowing what we know about John's gospel, the way he tells the stories, we have to believe that there's more to it than just that I don't have enough food here to feed all 8 of us right now. I think it is the symbolic significance of what Jesus says here that holds the answer to this question. What Jesus tells them to do is to bring to him what it is that they have collected. And I believe that the significance here is that this is really an illustration of the work that they are now going to be doing. Remember, we said one of those unanswered questions of the text is, what's next for the disciples? And here I think we find out that they're going to be doing this, that they are going to become fishers of men, like we know from the story in Luke chapter 5, and that they are going to take what they collect and they are going to bring it to the Lord. They're going to take what they have collected by following the Lord's instruction and blessed by his power and present it to Jesus. There's a similar thing in Romans 15, some of you may remember. The language is a little different there, but Paul says that I'm like a priest, and I go out and I gather the Gentiles and I bring them to God like an offering. The sacrificial idea is not here in John 21, but that same idea is here, that they're going to be collecting people and bringing them to the Lord. Remember back in chapter 11 and verse 52, when Caiaphas had unwittingly prophesied that Jesus would die for the nation so that he might bring or collect into one the children of God who were scattered abroad. And so, like we saw in the gathering of the fragments at the feeding of the 5,000, and like that statement here in John chapter 11. John is reminding us that this is what Jesus has come to do. Remember the sermon from last Sunday that Jesus ends the exile, that he calls the exiles to come. And that is exactly what his death and resurrection and the message of the gospel about it is designed to do. And that's what these apostles are now going to be doing. They're going to go out and preach this message, and it will bring God's people together in Jesus Christ by the gospel. And like the bringing of the fish to Jesus here, they're going to be bringing people. And so they are going to be Jesus' agents, as it were, in gathering the chosen ones or the remnant to the Lord. We're told here in verse 11 that Simon Peter went and drew the net to the land, and so he helps the guys drag the net up onto the shore. We're told that it is full of large fish, specifically 153 of them. If you are amused by these kinds of things, you might want to look sometime at some of the literature that has been written, especially the older literature from the medieval times and before, where exegetes have been trying to figure out the significance of the number 153. And there have been some pretty fantastic explanations of that number. I don't think it's symbolic of anything. It doesn't factor into anything symbolic. It's not obviously a symbolic number. I think it is an eyewitness kind of touch. I think this is the kind of thing that somebody who was there would have known. That these men threw the fish on the beach there, and they wanted to see how much they had caught, and after they counted, this is the number that they came up with, and that a person who had been there would have known this. So I think it's probably just one of those little details that an eyewitness would know, and it gives credibility to the story. But we're also told here that the fish were large. These are good fish. These are not little fish that you would, throw away. These are keepers, as it were. And we're told that even though there were so many, that the net was not torn. You remember back in John chapter 6, Jesus said, "Gather up all the fragments left over from the loaves and the fish, so that none of them are left." You get that same kind of idea here, that none of them got away, that none of them slipped through. The net did not break. Everything was collected and accounted for. And so Jesus then presumably eats with them here. Jesus has them go through these instructions here, and in verse 12, Jesus said, "Well, come have breakfast." And there's kind of an interesting scene here. None of the disciples ventured to question him, saying, "Who are you?" Because they know who it is. They know now that it is the Lord. Remember back in chapter 16 and verse 23, Jesus said, "In that day you will not ask me any questions." And so this is kind of an illustration of the fulfillment of that. And it's not just the fulfillment of that, but the idea is that their understanding is coming, that their insight, their appreciation of what is going on is dawning, and they are now beginning to see that Jesus really is alive. And John tells us in verse 14, this is the third time that Jesus appeared to them. Presumably what he means by that is appeared to them as a group of people, counting the two in chapter 20 as well. And so we have here the idea that there can be no doubt that the reality of Jesus' resurrection is established, because it's not just that they saw him once or twice. They saw him together as a group of men 3 times. And therefore they now know, they understand, they've come to this kind of enlightenment, as it were. Now that doesn't mean that they understand everything at this point, obviously. But the day is dawning, as it were. The light is coming on. It says there in verse 13, Jesus came and took the bread and gave it to them, and the fish likewise. We hear there a little bit of an echo of the feeding of the 5,000, the loaves and the fishes. And so when we think about that story and Jesus having them to collect the fragments, representing the collection of the people of faith, and we have here that Jesus has just told them to bring the fish, and now we have the bread and the fish. All of it is kind of combining to answer that second question that we noted, the question of what's next for the disciples. Here we have our answer, that they're going to be in the job or doing the job of collecting people to bring them to God. Well, in verses 15 and following, there is apparently a walk that Jesus and Peter are going on. We're told down here in verse 20 that as this conversation is going on, Peter turned around and saw the disciple whom Jesus loved following them. So the picture here is that Jesus probably says to Peter, let's take a walk. And this other disciple is kind of behind them. Maybe all of the other disciples are a little bit behind. Jesus probably makes it clear that I need to talk to Peter for a second, so give me a little space. And Jesus and Peter have this very famous conversation. So they go on this walk, and this is, of course, the famous conversation where Jesus asked Peter 3 times, Simon, do you love me? You'll notice the first time Jesus asks him, it is, do you love me more than these? It is not particularly clear from this text exactly what Jesus meant by that. Some have suggested, do you love me more than going back to your former life? Maybe in the context that's a possibility, although I don't think that that is my favorite interpretation here. Could it mean something like, do you love me more than the other disciples love me? Or it could mean, do you love me more than you love them? At the end of the day, it probably doesn't matter too much because this particular part of the question does not seem to be where the emphasis lies. Jesus doesn't repeat this part of the question. The question is, Simon, do you love me? And however the exact nuance of that plays out, Jesus wants to know, am I number one? Whether it be compared to the other disciples or his love for them or whatever, Jesus wants to know, do you love me above all else? I think that's the basic idea. And of course, Peter says yes. And so Jesus says, well, tend my lambs. And then a second time, Jesus says, Simon, do you love me? And Peter says, well, yes, Lord, you know that I love you. He says, shepherd my sheep. And then he says to him the third time, Simon, son of John, do you love me? And Peter is getting a little bit upset at this time. It may be that he thinks Jesus doesn't believe him, or maybe it is reminding him of his 3 denials, that now this is the third time that Jesus has asked. But Peter says, Lord, you know that I love you. And Jesus says again, tend my sheep. A lot of hay has been made about different words for love. There are 2 different words for love in this text. And, the question has been asked, well, does Jesus mean one kind of love and then a different kind of love in the other question? And then there is tend my lambs versus feed my sheep or shepherd my sheep. Different words for tending and sheep. None of that, it seems to me, is the point of this. It really doesn't matter what word for love or sheep or shepherding is used, because these are functionally the same question every time. Now, what we see here really is the restoration of Peter. that the three affirmations of Peter's love are meant to be the counter to Peter's three denials the night that Jesus was arrested. As Peter had denied Jesus 3 times, so Jesus now insists that he affirm his love for him 3 times. And so that other bit of unfinished business, what about the relationship between Peter and Jesus? Does that ever get fixed? That is answered here, I believe. That in his 3 affirmations, he is restored into his right relationship with Jesus. Well, Jesus is not finished. And in verse 18, Jesus says, "Let me tell you something, Peter. When you were younger, you used to gird yourself, walk wherever you wished. You were in control of your being and your movements. You could go where you want, when you wanted, gird yourself up and do what you wanted to do. But when you grow old, you will stretch out your hands and someone else will gird you." There's been a lot made about the stretching out of the hands, and again, I don't think that's the important thing here. The idea is that, Peter, the day is coming when you won't be in charge of what you get to do, that you'll be in a more helpless condition, and you won't be girding yourself, somebody else will be girding you up. And you're going to be brought where you don't want to go, not where you would go, but under the control of somebody else. Now, what does Jesus mean by this? Well, John tells us, the narrator, that Jesus is signifying by what kind of death he would glorify God. I guess the interesting question here is, did Peter understand that at the moment? Did Peter know that Jesus was talking about Peter's death? My guess is that Peter probably did not. That this statement, if we hadn't been told the interpretation, doesn't sound necessarily like a description of death. But the author of this gospel, and again, probably I think the Apostle John, is probably writing after the death of Peter. He knows that Peter has now died, and he is able now, with hindsight, to look back to this story and say, I know what Jesus was talking about now, because this became true ultimately in the way that Peter died. Whatever Peter is thinking, and even if Peter doesn't understand this to be a reference to his death, it probably isn't something good. You're going to be bound or girded and taken where you don't want to go. That would not have been a good thing. And so Jesus kind of gives him this ominous hint, and then he tells Peter, "Follow me." Back in chapter 10, Jesus, remember, had said that he was the good shepherd, and that the good shepherd lays down his life for the sheep. And here Jesus is making this connection. Now again, whether Peter understood it or not is a different question. But I think with hindsight, we can look at this and see what Jesus is getting at. That whereas before Peter had been afraid to be associated with Jesus, he had denied knowing Jesus 3 times in one evening. Now he has reaffirmed his love for Jesus. Jesus says, "Peter, there are some difficult things that await you in your future, and I want you to succeed this time where you failed last time. Rather than become afraid and not go forward, this time I want you to go through with it. I want you to follow me all the way to this death that he had described." And so Peter will get the opportunity to be like Jesus, perhaps in a way that he never could have imagined. That he will die ultimately for the same work that Jesus was involved in, the tending of the lambs of God, that Peter would be called upon to lay down his life in caring for those sheep as well. So Peter, as we said, probably understood that this was something ominous, something that was not good, whatever it meant specifically. And so we have this kind of famous scene here in verse 20. Peter turned around and saw the other disciple behind them. It's the disciple who had leaned on Jesus' chest at the Last Supper and said, Jesus, who is it that betrays you? It's that same disciple, very close to Jesus, wanting always to be around Jesus. And Peter looks back and sees him and says to Jesus, well, what about him? And Jesus says, Peter, if I want him to remain until I come, what is that to you? You follow me. And so this is an interesting little story here, obviously. And I'd like to pause for just a moment to kind of unpack what this thing might mean. First of all, we don't know Peter's state of mind here. Why does Peter ask, well, what about him? Could Peter have been angry? That, hey, why do I have to die and what about him? Was he curious? Was he concerned? Maybe his love for his fellow apostle was that he's not going to have to go through this. I don't know why Peter asks about the other disciple, and we probably ought not get off on speculation about that. What Jesus does is brings Peter back to the main subject. And he tells Peter, don't worry about that guy. If I have a different plan for him, if my plan for you is that you give your life and he remains until I come, what is that to you? Your job is to follow me. And there are, just very quickly, three things I'd like to remind us about as we think about this little story. First of all, we all have a part to fulfill in the plan of God. I truly do believe that God uses us today as he has always used people throughout the biblical story. And that the truth be known that God has used us in ways that we probably never ever realized that we were being used. Like some of the characters here in the Gospel of John, especially the enemies of Jesus, who were doing God's will without knowing it. I think sometimes in our lives that is probably true. Not that we're enemies of Jesus, but that we've actually done things that God was using us for without perhaps even realizing the good that we were doing. Sometimes we do understand that there is a certain thing that God wants me to do, that I've been given an opportunity here that is very clear that I need to do something for God. But whatever it is, whether we realize it at the time or not, I do believe that God uses people to accomplish his work in the world. That seems to be clear throughout the Bible, from one end to the other. And God can use us, and he will use us as he accomplishes his plan for the world. Of course, I have to cooperate with it. God may put me in a situation. God may give me an opportunity, but I have to take advantage of it and be the light and be the salt of the earth that I'm supposed to be. But if I will do what I'm supposed to do, God can use me, and God can use you as well in all kinds of ways to accomplish what he wants done on this earth. The reason I bring that up is because not only is it an implication of the text here, but I think it's a very important perspective that we need to have on our lives. That as we're going about our business, that we need to be cognizant of the fact that God can use me and God is using me. Secondly, though, it seems clear from this text that God has his reasons, God has his plans, and it is God's business to use each of his children in the way that he wishes. That God's plan for your life, or how he's going to use you, or the situation that he's going to put you into, is very likely not going to be the same for me. That God is going to use us in different ways in the accomplishment of his will. And it is not our place to be either jealous or resentful or anything like that of how God uses other people compared to how he uses me. That I need to be happy to let God use me the way he wants to use me, and to let God use you the way he wants to use you, and not be competitive about that, not wish that God would have used me for your work or you for mine, or that kind of thing, to be second guessing the will of God, or wondering why couldn't it be this way, or imposing my will upon God's plan. No, what God wants is for me to be happy to let him use me the way that he sees fit. And so, kind of like what Paul says in the book of Romans, and quoting from the Old Testament, that the thing molded may not say to the maker, why did you make me this way? That my job is to accept the role and the opportunities and the situations that God has given to me in my life, and to use them as the opportunity arises so that God can use me in his work, and to be happy to do that and let God use other people as he sees fit. And that seems to be what Jesus is getting at here. Peter, don't worry about that guy. I have a different plan for him. What if I were to have him live longer than you? Maybe live until I come again. That's not your concern, Peter. Don't worry about that. What I want you to do is to follow me. And so, verse 22, you follow me. And I have to remember that. And you need to remember that too. My job is to follow Jesus on the path on which I find myself. And that is what will determine the success and the significance of the life that I have lived. Not by comparing my life with other people, my accomplishments with theirs or vice versa, or trying to insert myself in ways that God has not given to me, or things like that. My job is to follow Jesus in the opportunities that the Lord puts in front of me. And if I will do that and let God use me in those opportunities, then I believe my life will have been successful regardless of what other people are doing. There's a couple more things here before this chapter ends that we'll notice very briefly. In verse 23, the saying went out among the brethren that this disciple would not die. But Jesus did not say to him that he wouldn't die. He said, if I want him to remain until I come, what is that to you, Peter? Jesus did not say John's going to live forever. He said, what if I wanted that? Now, this is kind of interesting. One of the things that we can piece together, not only from the New Testament, but from some other sources as well, is that immediately after Jesus left the earth, of course, the gospel was circulated by word of mouth. The stories about Jesus were circulated by the people who knew Jesus, by the people who had interacted with him. And so that would be primarily the apostles. But you think about the people that Jesus healed in the various cities and villages. They would have been able to tell people, this is what happened to me on that day. Here's where I was. This is what Jesus said. Some scholars have suggested that, well, you can't rely on that. Kind of like the old game of telephone, where you whisper something into somebody's ear and they repeat it, and then and the story gets mangled up and changed as it goes. Some scholars have suggested that that's what happened to the stories about Jesus. That these stories got embellished, and the tales got taller, to use their words as it were, and that some of these things that we're told about Jesus probably didn't happen, but got added with the telling of the stories. And their idea is that this period of oral transmission lasted for a long, long time until finally the Gospels got written down in this exaggerated form. Verse 23 of the Gospel of John tells me that that didn't happen, though. Because here John says, now, there was a misunderstanding about this statement. Some of the guys there thought that Jesus said John wasn't going to die, or that's how this got twisted and repeated somehow. But John says, I'm here to tell you that I was there and Jesus didn't say it. And so this idea that the stories about Jesus got blown out of proportion, that they got embellished and inflated, excuse me, this little verse tells me that that didn't happen. Because while the eyewitnesses were alive, they were able to say, no, that's not the truth. That didn't happen. That's not what he said. And so, do we know that the stories about Jesus are correct? Yes, and here's a really good example of how we know that. Add to that also that the gospel accounts were written during the time when the eyewitnesses were alive as well. And so, as these accounts got written down, we can be sure that they are telling us the truth as well. But that's kind of an interesting little thing that I think comes out of verse 23. In verse 24, the author certifies the account. This is the disciple who is testifying to these things and wrote these things, and we know that his testimony is true. And then we get the final statement of the gospel. There are many other things which Jesus did, which if they were written in detail, I suppose that even the world itself would not contain the books that would be written. What is this statement doing here? What is the point of this statement? One of the questions that some scholars have raised about it is this really a statement about this gospel, or is this meant to be a statement about all four gospels? Given the order of our texts, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, some scholars have argued that this was a statement that there are many other things which Jesus did that are not even written in all four of the Gospels. But it could apply to this Gospel as well. Certainly, John has already told us in chapter 20, Jesus did many other signs. And so that is kind of an interesting question, although I don't think it ultimately really matters all that much. But what's the point? The point is that I haven't told you nearly everything that happened in the life of Jesus. That Jesus was far more impressive. He was a far greater figure. That his wisdom, his words, his deeds were far more impressive than what a few pages of narrative can convey. And of course, if you've been reading along and hearing the Gospel of John, imagine yourself as somebody who is listening to this for the first time. And you come to the end of the story, to this great conclusion that he must have been the Son of God. He's raised from the dead. Look at the signs that he did. These signs, like it says in chapter 20, pointed to the fact that he was the Son of God. And then John says, you don't know the half of it. Remember the words of the Queen of Sheba in 1 Kings 10 and verse 7? She came to Solomon and said, I've been told about you, and I haven't even been told half about how great you are. And that's kind of what John is saying here, that this is the testimony I'm giving you, that these things should tell you who Jesus is, but there is so much more that is so much even more impressive in its cumulative effect, that you can be sure that these things are the truth. Well, that brings us to a close of our study of the Gospel of John over these several weeks. I hope that you've enjoyed the study. I always enjoy studying the life of Jesus, whether in John or the other Gospels. It's one of my favorite things to do, and I hope that it's been a good study for you as well. I'm going to keep you in suspense as to what we're going to study next. We'll announce that very soon. Hope you have a good evening and hope to see you all very, very soon.